Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another webinar on the Societies of Photographers members group. It's great to be back here. I hope everyone's had a fantastic weekend, and I'm really looking forward to tonight's webinar. And what a webinar we've got lined up for you tonight. So tonight we're being joined by Nick Dale, and Nick's going to be talking on the essential guide to wildlife photography. It's absolutely brilliant to get Nick on board. He has got such a wealth of experience when it comes to wildlife photography. It really is. It was great when Nick emailed in and said that he wanted to do a webinar for you guys. So if you don't know Nick has been a wildlife photographer for quite some time and has sold many of his images. So sold over 12,000 images to buyers including National Geographic, the BBC Wildlife Magazine, the Sunday Times, the Evening Standard, and many, many more. Also, there's been plenty of personal sellers, so art collectors buy his images. He also does exhibitions, so he's had solo exhibitions at Norman Plasto Gallery in Wimbledon and Lumi Arts and 508 Kings Road, just to name a few. So we're really lucky to have Nick. He's also won a plethora of awards from the Sunday Times, Travel Big Shoot. He's won competitions with us, so Animals in Action and all that kind of stuff. He's won the In the Wild photography competition with Sinwhip. Nick is also it does tours and teaches photography as well. So we're going to bring Nick in without further ado. So he will introduce himself a little bit more. So hello, Nick. How are we doing?
Very well, thank you.
Good stuff. So a very brief introduction from me, but if you'd like to maybe extend on that, we've got people tuning in from all around the globe here at the moment, which is fantastic to see.
Very good. Yes, thanks very much. So yes, I've been a wildlife photographer since 2013. I was very keen on wildlife photography when I was younger. When I was about 15, I had my own film SLR, and I even spoke to my mum about going to study photography and turning professional. I asked her advice, and she said, well, you can always take it up as a hobby later. So that was that for the next 30 years. Fortunately, somebody sent me a random email inviting me to climb Mount Kenya and go on safari, and I jumped at the chance. So I immediately started taking pictures and bought bigger and better cameras, and that was the start of my wildlife photography career. So back in the old days, I had a proper job. I went to Oxford, read English, and then I joined a consulting firm. So I was a consultant for a while, worked for various American firms, and then worked freelance for a bit. And then I retired when I was 29, not because I was fabulously wealthy, unfortunately, but because a friend of mine had a ski chalet and he wanted to rent it out, but he also wanted to use it himself. So I just said, quite on the spur of the moment, well, if you rent it to me, then you can come whenever you like. And there it was. Suddenly I was away for 6 months, and I rented out my place in Notting Hill and managed to buy a few more places. Those were the glory days of buy-to-let investing. And I was away for about 7 years in America and Australia, Belgium, various places. And when I came back, I decided consulting was too stressful. So I decided to go quality of life. And I've done various things. I managed an air display team. I've been an extra in various films, including a James Bond film, Skyfall, various things. And then eventually, as I say, I happened upon wildlife photography again. And I'm also an academic tutor, private tutor. So I do a few hours a week teaching kids 11 plus. All right. So if you're happy, we can get cracking.
Yeah, we normally leave it 3-4 minutes, so we've just hit that mark now. So while people are settling in, so yeah, fantastic. Do you want me to bring up your presentation?
Yes, please.
Right, I will leave you to it. But thank you very much for joining us tonight, Nick. I'm really looking forward to this webinar and hear what you've got to say. So, any questions? Please pop them in the comments, and I'll either chip in halfway through, or we'll keep them all to the end and pitch your questions at Nick. But for now, thank you very much, Nick. I'll leave you to it, bud.
Thanks very much. So, just to give you an idea of what this is going to be like, I'm a teacher. I teach photography. I teach English, maths, various other subjects, sailing, skiing, goodness knows what. So for me, it's all about learning. So I want this to be interactive. You know, if you don't understand something, please put your hand up and put a comment, just to make sure that you understand everything. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. And so the main output of this should be to give you a few ideas about what you can do the next time you're out on safari or in a foreign country and you fancy taking some animals. Okay, so I've used a lot of my own images, obviously, for this presentation, but the idea is to teach you the rules of composition and to give you an idea of the kind of things that can win competitions or make money. So I'll crack off with the first slide. So first of all, we all need equipment, obviously, and I realise that not all of you will be wildlife photographers, so it's worthwhile just giving a few notes on what kind of equipment you need. I don't actually need too much equipment. I think when I first started out, I just bought everything in sight. Photographers like bright, shiny new kit, don't they? It's a bit of a money pit. But really, you only need 1 or 2 camera bodies, 1 or 2 long lenses, and maybe a monopod or a tripod, although if you go to Africa, that's really not necessary. And then a few other basics, plus a laptop. And most people have laptops these days. So I think it's probably worthwhile trying it out without buying too much stuff. And in fact, these days, it's quite possible to get lenses or even cameras for hire from places like Lenses for Hire or Fat Llama or various places. So it doesn't necessarily have to cost you an awful lot of money. If you're not in wildlife photography at the moment and you fancy trying it out, then I'm sure that the kit you have at the moment should be good enough. All I would say, though, is that you really need a longish lens. And I would say that has to be 400mm and above. I have an 80-400 and also an 800mm prime, which is a bit of a monster, and I can take all the pictures I want, which is fine. I spend a lot of time in Africa. So last year I went to Tanzania and Kenya as a resident photographer. So I was teaching photography and going out on game drives every day, morning and evening, for about 4 months. And those were the 2 lenses I used. Only those 2 lenses. I took all my others, I just never used them. I had grand ideas of taking some pictures of the night sky in Tanzania, thinking it would be wonderful. And eventually I thought, I'm just too knackered. I was working 18 hours a day, 9 hours on safari and 9 hours posting my images. So I just didn't have the energy. So camera and the long lens, I would say when it comes to the camera, you really need a DSLR. I know these days a lot of mirrorless cameras which do the job and are certainly a lot lighter, but I'm just not quite happy with those, mostly because you have an electronic viewfinder rather than an optical one. So there's always a little bit of lag. So you're not viewing the world as is, you're viewing the world as it was 100th of a second ago, which may not sound like much, but wildlife photography is measured in hundredths of a second or even thousandths of a second. So I don't like the idea of mirrors. Having said that, if I put my battery grip on my D850 and I marry it with my 800mm lens, that's about 10 pounds. Yes, that's a lot of weight. And it's almost impossible to hand hold it. So that's fine when you're on a Jeep, but if you're walking around, that's impossible. So you have to make your own decisions about these things. But just for the reach, really, you need the long lens. And when it comes to the other accessories, I mean, you might need a polarizing filter if you like to take the odd landscape shot, increases saturation, darkens the blue skies, gets rid of reflections on wet leaves, or if you're taking shots of waterfalls and so on, fair enough. I've actually ended up with about 4 polarizing filters that I've never really used, but that's possible. And then when it comes to monopods or tripods, again, as I say, if you're on game drives in Africa, you don't really need monopods or tripods. It's just impossible to use them on a Jeep. It doesn't have a stable base, they take up too much room, and so on and so forth. So all you really need in a Jeep is a beanbag. And 9 times out of 10, the local safari lodge will have 1 or 2 of those, so you don't even need to provide your own. I have a bag that I can use as a beanbag if I fill it with chickpeas or something, but I've never had to use it myself. And then finally, lens cloths, blowers, something like that, just to keep your lenses clean. After all, if you've got dirty glass, you'll get dirty pictures. Not that kind of dirty pictures, the other kind of dirty pictures. And it's interesting, it's worrying a little bit how dirty your glass can get. I've been in places like Botswana and India where you get this very fine red dust. And when you look at the lens of the camera with the lens hood on, it's quite dark and you can't really tell and you think it's fine. And then I remember being in India once, and I just swabbed it with my lens cloth, brought it back out, and suddenly I could see there was an enormous smear of red dust on it. So it's worthwhile just bearing that in mind and cleaning it every few minutes, just in case. And finally, this is not for everybody, but I think it's really important to work on your pictures on the day. I spoke to Mark Carwadine once. He used to be the chairman of the judges for the Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition, and I met him on a cruise to Spitsbergen once. And when I told him about this, when I said I always keep up to date processing my images, he said, "Oh my God, that would be amazing. I've still got images from 126 trips that I've never even looked at." So I guess he's a busy guy. But I always feel a little bit uncomfortable if I haven't been through my images before the next game drive. Obviously, sometimes you take so many images that you just don't have time. There was one day when I took 4,032 images of wildebeest crossing the lake. So that took me a while. But generally, I like to go through them. And when I say go through them, what I mean is rate them, which means I have to decide which ones are worth trying to sell and which ones aren't, and also adding titles and captions and keywords. And that takes a lot of time. I generally use Lightroom on my machine, but these days you can get Lightroom and Photoshop bundled together. So that's fairly cheap. It's 10 quid a month or something. And if you contribute to Adobe stock images, then they give it to you for free. So what else can you do before I leave? Plan your trip, obviously, right place, right time, right price, all the usual things. It's important to do a bit of research. Obviously, if you want to take pictures of a particular animal, you'll need to know their movements, what time of day, what time of year, where you need to go to find those animals. I'm generally not very good at research, but going to Africa, you're bound to see something. And I've been fairly successful in seeing cheetah kills, for instance. I went to Kachechi in the Masai Mara and saw 5 cheetah kills in a week, which was sensational. And on my recent trip, I saw 4 male lions take down a female buffalo, which was just sensational. And what else? Check your equipment. Yes, it's all very well getting a nice posh new lens or a new camera and leaving it in the wrapping paper until you go away. But the problem is when you actually get out on safari or wherever you're going on your photo trip, you end up not knowing how to use it. And there were quite a few people on my trip last year who ended up using their safari as a getting to know your camera exercise, which is a great shame. And obviously the quality of the pictures deteriorates because you don't quite know how to do things, you don't know the limitations of your camera, you don't know what it can do, what it can't do. So please practice before you go and you will see the benefits. And I'm a little bit OCD, so I like to do things like set the camera metadata, the time zone, location, all that kind of good stuff. Update the firmware. I've just been updating the firmware on my Nikon D850 and D810, just little things like that. Most of the time it doesn't really matter, but sometimes there might be an improvement in compatibility or something. Obviously you need to rent your lens or your DSLR if you need to, if you don't have your own. Basic things like charging your batteries. I once taught a guy who was very assiduous. He made sure that he charged all his batteries before his photo lesson down in Richmond Park. And then he packed all his equipment, came to the park, and then we sat down and he suddenly said, "Oh, I left all my batteries in the charger." So we had a very nice lesson, which was entirely theoretical because he couldn't take a single picture. So make sure that doesn't happen to you. And finally, pack your camera bag and please don't put it in the hold. The only time I put my camera bag in the hold, my laptop came out with an enormous hole in the bottom and the memory board was damaged and one set of RAM was unusable. So I learned my lesson, never in the hold. When it comes to wardrobe, this is fairly common sense stuff. So neutral colors, I realize that animals are mostly colorblind, so it doesn't really matter. It's the guests that are more concerned about it. So if you're wearing shocking pink or something, then you might get a few funny looks. But yes, neutral colors, earth tones, as they say. A few layers that you can take off because it does get quite cold in the morning, particularly in Africa and other places. I have a couple of pairs of trousers with zip-off legs and lots of pockets, which is useful for spare batteries and memory cards and things. And I find that a sun hat with a brim all the way around is better than a baseball cap, just because the baseball cap brim is quite hard and it tends to get knocked around and it's difficult to use with the viewfinder. And then finally, hiking boots or trainers. To be honest, unless you're on a walking safari, you don't really need hiking boots. There aren't any snakes in Africa, and if you're in a jeep, you just won't come across anything. It's perfectly fine to use trainers. And then obviously a few other safety bits and pieces like Malarone for malaria, sun cream, insect repellent, and make sure your passport has 6 months validity. Normally, most countries are a bit hot on that. Insurance for your equipment and also for medical evacuation if you want to do that. And also when it comes to vaccinations, increasingly these days, if you're traveling from a country which has had a problem with yellow fever, then you have to have had your shots. Now, I was once almost turned away from a flight because I didn't have my vaccination card with me. So make sure you have your card and obviously get your shots in advance. Now, when it comes to the actual game drive, or when I say game drive, I mean photo shoot out in the field, then what do I take? Again, I don't really take that much. I don't certainly take a camera bag. I just take my 2 camera bodies, my D810 and D850, but obviously that's a bit more expensive. But I also take my 800mm lens, my 80-400, and then maybe the polarizing filter. Maybe if I'm on a cruise ship or something around the Galapagos or Spitsbergen, I might take the polarizer just because the reflection's off the water. But generally that's not really necessary. And then the basics, spare batteries, lens cloth, bean bag, all things I've mentioned. One of the things I try to do is to keep track of the species that I see. On my Africa trip, for instance, last year, I saw 60 mammal species and 208 bird species. So it's always nice to be able to put these things down in a blog post or something afterwards. And I tend to put them in my iPhone. And I also keep a brief diary in notes. So just basically where we went, if there are any major sightings. It's not Bridget Jones's diary. I don't put how many cigarettes I've smoked or how many calories I've eaten, but just the basic stuff, from a photographic point of view. And then, yes, the usual stuff I mentioned about clothing and protection. And when it comes to food and water, generally in Africa at least, you don't really need to worry about that. There are usually lots of flunkies wandering around with all the food and water you need, so that's fine. Now, when it comes to camera settings, obviously you could go on and on and on, but here's a brief overview. Please, if you have any more detailed questions, just put a comment and I'll try and handle it later. But briefly, I tend to work in manual, but I use auto ISO. So it's not really manual from an exposure point of view. So the joys of auto ISO, if you haven't used it, are that you just don't need to worry about exposure. So you have control over the shutter speed and the aperture, which are the important things, and then you let the camera worry about the exposure. Now, there are occasions, obviously, when you need to use exposure compensation, when there's a very, bright scene, like in Spitsbergen, there'll be a polar bear on the ice. Cameras are set up to believe that the world is 18% grey, and obviously it's not, particularly in Spitsbergen. So at that point, you have to add a couple of stops of exposure compensation, or you can simply do everything manual. I know that when Terry Donnelly was talking earlier, he's a sports photographer, and he just meters on a mid-tone in the middle of the pitch, and then he just sets everything, he locks it down, set it and forget it. And that's one way of doing it. That way you don't need exposure compensation, but that only works if the lighting is constant, which is fine during a football game, but it may not be fine if you're out in the bush and sometimes the sun is behind a cloud and sometimes it's not, and so on and so forth. However, what I would say is when you're taking pictures of birds, then it's more important to do that because typically birds will be against a very bright sky and it's just very difficult. So what I would do is pre-focus, find a mid-tone, lock everything down. So don't use auto ISO for that. Probably use a few more focus points as well, just to make sure you capture focus. And then, as I say, once it's locked down, you don't have to worry about it. So when it comes to the shutter speed or the aperture, what I would do is I would choose my shutter speed based on the situation. So if I'm doing portraits, whether it's an animal or a bird, generally you won't need much more than a 500th of a second. Now, if I had my long lens, the 800mm, then maybe I would boost that up to 1,000th. The old rule of thumb is 1 over the focal length of your lens. But if you're using vibration reduction or image stabilization on Canon, then that doesn't really apply. So the main limiting factor is the speed of the animal's movement. And if it's just sitting there, which lions tend to do quite a lot, then you don't really need more than a 500th. And what you can actually do is start with something like a 500th and then gradually work your way down to improve your ISO. So start with 500th and then think, well, would it work with a 250th? Oh, that seems to be okay. Chimp a bit, look on the back of your camera, go to 100%. If it's sharp, carry on going. As long as the animal's static, you can carry on going as far as you like. You might get down to a 60th or something even slower, depending on the length of your lens. Okay? But as soon as the animals are moving, then you have to be careful. So a lot of people initially, when I started out with wildlife, used to say, oh, well, 1,000th of a second should be fine. But I've seen quite a few other photographers give demos and videos and so on, and they're talking serious numbers. So I remember when I went on a few trips with Paul Connolly with Exodus, and he used to tell this story. It's a bit confusing and rambling, but the basic idea is if you're going to for a shit, you better lock the door. So what he meant was, if you're going to do something, you better do it properly, just in case. Now, his view was that you needed something like a 2,000th if you've got animal movement. And that might be cheetah chasing its prey, or it might be cheetah cubs playing in a tree. But lock the door. In other words, go high. 2,000th of a second, even higher than that sometimes. And it's particularly important for bird photography. Birds move very fast. Small birds move even faster than big birds. So you may be up to a 3,200th or even a 4,000th of a second. The good news is you won't usually have problems with ISO because they'll generally be in the sunshine, obviously depending on where you are, but in Africa that's certainly the case. Most of the glorious exotic wildlife destinations, that's true, apart from Canada or Alaska, where you have to put up with rain and so on. So ISO shouldn't be a factor, but it's always better to have a sharp image, yes, and a noisy image, than a smooth image and a blurry image. So with a high shutter speed and a high ISO, you get sharp and maybe a little bit noisy. But with a lower shutter speed, you get a little bit of blur, even though the ISO is low. So you can always denoise later, but you can't sharpen. All those sharpening tools that you see in Lightroom or Photoshop, they're not really sharpening. All they do is add contrast, which is a very different thing. Yes, Topaz denoise can get rid of noise, but it can't sharpen. Yes, you can add contrast all you like, but it doesn't sharpen. That's important. So bolt the door when it comes to shutter speed. When it comes to aperture, generally what you're doing is you're trying to separate the animal from the background. So lots of ways of doing that, but the aperture is the most recognized one. So if you use a wide aperture, shoot wide open, whether that's f4, f2.8 if you're very lucky, or f5.6, which is more normal with a long lens, then you can guarantee that you get the maximum amount of light into your camera, which helps with autofocus problems. And also it means that your depth of field is going to be suitably narrow, which means that the background will be thrown out. So that has a couple of benefits. One, it means that the background is not distracting. So if generally in the places where we shoot wildlife, there are going to be trees or bushes or mountains or hills or something, we don't want that in the image. We want a nice smooth bokeh, as they call it. So a nice smooth green background or something plain. The wider the aperture, the smoother the background, the creamier the blur, which is what we want. And that offsets the subject, which is going to be nice and sharp. So the human eye likes things that are big, colorful, sharp, and warm in tone. So that's perfect for a lion or something, or a leopard. Yes? If you fill the frame, it's big. If you get your focus right and your depth of field right, it's going to be sharp, and everything else is going to be blurred behind it. It's going to be warm in tone, and everything is right about it. Okay? Now, sometimes you want to take an environmental portrait, which is fair enough, but most of the time, we want to make sure that the subject is set off from the background. Okay, a few other settings. Generally, when it comes to the focus settings, you have to be on continuous. So I'm a big fan of continuous. It means you can follow the animal's motion. In Canon terms, that's AI servo. In Nikon terms, that's AFC. I would select single point focus, which means you just have one focal point. And that means you put that point over the eye, always the eye. Okay, unless you have an extreme example where you're shooting from behind an animal for some bizarre reason. Okay, generally we want the eye. If you see a picture where the eye is sharp, you don't care about anything else. Now, sometimes, obviously, you might want to make sure that the nose or the muzzle is in focus as well. It looks a bit strange if you're face on to an animal like a duck or something, and the eyes are sharp, great, but the beak is not. It just looks a bit weird. So you might want to go up to f8 or something just to make sure that happens. But generally, as long as the eye's in focus, you're golden. What else? Back button focusing. Now, this is something that if you're not a wildlife photographer, then you may not have tried out. But I think it's really useful, not just for wildlife, also for landscapes. So what does it do? Basically, it separates focusing from shutter release. So that was always the way it used to be before we had autofocus. You had to manually focus with your left hand and then take the picture with your right finger. But these days with autofocus, you tend to half press the shutter and then fully press to take the picture. Now, the problem with that is if the animal suddenly starts to move. Yes? So we're talking about AFC now, continuous mode. So if you take a picture using back button focusing, you've got two big benefits. One is that you can focus and recompose very easily. So if I want to take a picture of a lion, I focus on the eye, and then maybe the eye needs to be outside that group of central focus points. So I need to recompose. All I do is take my thumb off the back button and the focus is locked. And I can recompose all I like, no problem at all, take as many pictures I like until the animal moves, of course, and then I just have to press the back button again to refocus. The second benefit is if you have a moving animal, then you can simply keep your thumb on the back button and the camera will try to maintain focus wherever the animal goes. Now, in Nikon terms, I like to use the 3D version, but that's based on color, so it's not quite as useful in Africa where everything seems to be a shade of brown or green. Okay, but you can also use the single point version. You can use various ranges. You can use the dynamic 9 or dynamic 25, which just means 25 points or 9 points rather than 1. The danger with that is that the wrong point ends up with the focus. So if you're taking pictures of birds, fair enough, they're going to be far enough away that it doesn't really matter. But with big birds, for example, you may end up with one of the points grabbing focus on the wingtip when you want the lucky eye. So it's not ideal. I would use as few points as you can get away with. Try this, see what works. I also like to use auto horizon guides. It's amazing, even in a Jeep, you end up in some bizarre situations, bizarre positions, very painful positions, trying to get as low as possible or trying to do something. And it's just easier if you have the horizon guides because then you know when you're perfectly horizontal or perfectly vertical. And that's something you can set up with one of your function buttons very easily. And I tend to use daylight or cloudy white balance. I try and switch between the two just to make sure I have the right version. You can put it on auto, but as one of my guests last year once said, it's just not quite right. And I was surprised she was so worried about it, but I said, well, if you use the correct white balance, it should be fine. And lo and behold, that fixed their problem. So it does make a little bit of a difference. And then the final thing to say is experiment. It's very easy to take what you think is thousands of pictures, but you end up with one picture taken thousands of times. So even if you have a great scenario, you've got a fantastic sighting of a leopard in a tree or something, don't just spray and pray. Yes, you're going to get exactly the same picture pretty much. So try and be different. Can you use a slow pan? So pan across a moving animal using a slow shutter speed or something like that. Can you use a low key shot, so deliberately underexposed? Can you use high key or wide angle or black and white or anything? You've got to stand out from the herd, as I say. Right. What makes a good photograph? So when it comes to wildlife photography, this chap Paul Goldstein I mentioned, maybe one or two of you be on trips with him. Great raconteur, great storyteller, not a great photography teacher necessarily, and he would admit that. So he'll snap your head off first, and then maybe a couple of minutes later he'll say, well, actually, I think you need 500th of a second at f5.6. Okay, but in his words, the holy trinity of wildlife photography is dust, air, and spume. So dust in Africa when there's a bit of action, air when an animal is jumping, so he gets air, and then spume, like the shot of the bear in Alaska, where you've got a waterfall, you've got some spray, the equivalent of dust, except in a marine environment. However, I'm going to be spending the rest of the presentation talking about the rules of composition. So again, if you have any questions about any of this stuff, just put a comment in the notes and I'll sort you out. So, first one most people will probably know is the rule of thirds. This can be used a couple of different ways with a few variations. So first of all, you can divide the screen into thirds. Those two vertical lines and the two horizontal lines make 4 crossing points. So that's where you can put your main subject. That's one of the ways of using it. You can see this moth is roughly on one of those crossing points. The other way to use it is to use the line itself. If you have a large, long subject like a giraffe or something, you can put it on one of the lines and leave maybe some negative space on the other side. But it's just it gives a more pleasing image. Human eyes are funny things, and people have learned over the years, not just photographers but painters, that we don't like things bang in the middle, unless they're supposed to be symmetrical. If that's the case, fair enough. If you're taking a reflection of a tiger in the water or something, by all means put the horizon dead center. Looks beautiful, and it gives a more peaceful feel. But generally, we want to use the rule of thirds. Okay, focus on the eyes. So yes, I mentioned that before. The eyes, the window to the soul, are most important. We want to have a connection with the animal. So it's crucial that you get those eyes in focus. Tell a story. I'm a little bit cynical about this. I remember going to the Wildlife Photography of the Year exhibition, and there was a little rubric on a poster saying, oh, you have to tell a story. It's like, it's a picture. It's not an 800-page novel. It's not really a story. But due credit, okay, sometimes when you see a picture that does tell a story, you realize what they mean. And I think what they really mean is you have to imagine what's going on. You have to be able to see what the situation is. Yes, a scenario, if you like. So in this case, you can see exactly what's happening. This matriarchal elephant has come along, seen 6 lions, happily lying down under a tree, and she's decided that her herd doesn't want to be bothered with all these lions, so it's chased them away. Fantastic moment. You know exactly what's going on. It's telling a story, if you like, even though I wouldn't use those words. Speaking of elephants, the decisive moment. Probably a few of you know Henri Cartier-Bresson's book, The Decisive Moment, which he called something bizarre in French. But the idea is, whether you're taking street photography shots or wildlife shots, there is a moment which is decisive. Yes. In this case, I was on the banks of the Chobe River in Botswana, where there are lots of elephants, and I saw an elephant coming on the riverbank, and I saw it was going to pass right in front of us. So the pilot beached the boat, and then lo and behold, the elephant came past, and just to top it all off, she decided to give herself a dust bath. I took about 20 shots on continuous, and this was the decisive moment. So this was when the dust exploded over her back. Glorious moment, one of my favorite shots. I've now got it printed out 54 by 38 inches on my kitchen wall. Framing. So framing is important. Obviously, every picture is framed in the sense that there is a border to it, and you can put it in a frame. What I'm talking about is internal framing. So frames do a useful thing, something similar to leading lines, in that they lead the eye towards the subject. So in this case, you will obviously be led to the impala, partly because of the branch that goes from left to right diagonally, partly because of the horns, you might say, but also the branches at the top left, and also the grass at the bottom left. It's forming a kind of partial frame. So the impala is offset to the right, the partial frame, push your eyes across to the right to see the subject, rather than having your eyes dawdle on the tree or the bushes, which are not really interesting. Negative space is another one of those terms I can't really understand. Why they don't just call it space, I don't know. But it essentially means balancing the image with nothing. So generally when we take portraits, for instance, we use portrait format. Yes, it's called portrait because that's what it's used for. But generally when I take portraits, I use landscape format, and I put negative space on one side of the frame. So in this case, it's not a traditional portrait, but it does have that negative space. And I was also very lucky in this case because the background, so I thought, was green. It was just grass, it was the usual savanna type stuff. But funnily enough, it turned blue. I didn't do anything to it. I didn't play around in Photoshop or anything. It just turned blue, which I think gives it a nice kind of ethereal quality or mysterious quality. So a little bit of luck there. But the point is that negative space can balance out an image. Even though there's nothing there, it still has a kind of a weight to it. Leading lines I mentioned earlier, and of course in wildlife photography you don't generally get that many, certainly not in animals themselves, but occasionally you come across a path like this or a dirt track. Lots and lots of dirt tracks in Africa. You've been there. And in this case, this is the Galapagos. Obviously, this is a Galapagos giant tortoise. And when people see this image, they said, I bet you had like 6 weeks to take that picture, didn't you? In fact, I was in a complete panic because we had just parked the van and I saw this tortoise crossing the road. And I was desperate to get my kit out and get to the right position so I could take this shot. And you can see it's probably about 6 inches too far forward, but good enough for government work. I've sold this quite a few times, so it must be decent. So leading lines, what do? They basically lead the eye of the viewer to the subject. So whether you start at the top or the bottom, you are led towards the tortoise, which is great. Okay? Again, there are many ways of leading your eye to the subject, whether it's through sharpness versus blur, whether it's through the size of the object, whether it's through warm colors versus cool colors. All those things will help. But if you happen to see a situation like this, particularly with a long straight road, easy. As I mentioned before, when it comes to symmetrical compositions, then you really do want to center the subject, whether it's a bird or an animal. If it's symmetrical, then yes, emphasize that fact, if you want to, by putting it bang in the middle of the frame. So obviously most animals are not symmetrical in more than one dimension, so you have to center it either vertically or horizontally. But you might end up with something like this with a reflection below, in which case you can put it bang in the middle of the frame. But it's an option. Now, point of view or getting down to eye level is often described as the #1 rule of composition in wildlife photography. And even if it's not perhaps #1, it's certainly very, very important. Why do we do it? Because we want to enter the world of the animal. If I'm taking a picture of a penguin, for instance, and I'm standing over it looking down, A, the penguin will look small and insignificant, but B, it's kind of obvious what I'm doing. It's kind of obvious that I'm a person, not a penguin. So there's less of a connection with the subject. I could also, of course, take a picture looking up from the beach, and that does emphasize the size of the subject. It's quite useful, I guess, for taking pictures of elephants, for example. But when you get down to eye level, that's a happy medium. So it's almost as though you are the same kind of animal because you're at the same height. You've entered their world. It may not seem obvious, and it may seem like a great shot when you're just standing up taking a picture of an elephant. Fair enough. It's only when you see another shot, a similar shot taken from eye level, that you realize the difference. And then suddenly you have that light bulb moment and you think, now I understand. Silhouettes, there's a great opportunity for silhouettes, but you have to be in the right place. So when it comes to Africa, where I've spent most of my time shooting, it's important that you're in a concession, which is like a private area, not part of a national park. Why? Because national parks close at sunset. And I've been in that situation where just as you get the best light, your guide or your driver says, sorry guys, we have to be back at camp now, and we'll start motoring back, usually in desperate hurry because we're a bit late and you get fined or something. But if you're in a concession, you can stay out as long as you like. And when I was in the Masamara with Paul Goldstein, we ended up doing a silhouette shoot every day at about 6 o'clock. So we'd find a slope, generally a slope facing up towards the west, towards the setting sun, and then we would just find an animal. So in this case, this is a wildebeest. You need something which is recognizable, and you need to be sure that it's in a recognizable position. So if you have a lion, for instance, it doesn't necessarily have a great silhouette, unless maybe it's a male lion, but it will be best in profile, because if it's facing you, it doesn't really have a distinctive shape. So a lot of it is luck, but a chance favours the prepared mind. So if you're there, if you've got the right settings, if you know what you're doing, if you're there every single day doing the same kind of thing, eventually you end up with something like this. And the good news is, generally with silhouettes, you don't really need to worry about the settings on the camera, because, as I say, cameras think the world should be 18% prey, so it'll automatically underexpose, so the animals are just black outlines, which is what you want. Separation. So this was the first ever kill I saw in Africa, a cheetah taking down a Thompson's gazelle, and it was very, very exciting. But the point of this particular slide is the idea that we don't want overlap. Overlap is a bad word. Yes, we want separation between the two subjects. And in this case, obviously, the cheetah and the gazelle. If you can imagine this shot, except with the tail of the cheetah perhaps going across the Thompson gazelle's head, then you can kind of see what I mean. It works at the moment, but if they were overlapping each other, then you'd probably just think, oh, well, yes, I see what he was trying to do. That didn't quite work. So that's really important. Check the frame, make sure there's separation, make sure there's no overlap. Sometimes it's obviously a bit difficult when you have multiple animals. Yes, you just have to do your best. But separation is good. Motion blur. So all these things, they're just guidelines, obviously. Some people like motion blur, some people don't. So there's some people who want to crank up that shutter speed until the motion is absolutely frozen. Okay? If you want to do that with a dragonfly, then it has to be about an 8,000th of a second. Okay? In this case, I think it was about a 500th of a second, something like that. Usually quite fast, but with a dragonfly's wings, it just gives you the opportunity to see what the wings are like. You can see the shape, and a little bit of blur suggests movement. Yes. If things are frozen on the frame, then it's difficult to tell between a moving object and a stationary object. Imagine that you're taking a picture of a 200-mile-an-hour Formula One car. If you take it at an 8,000th of a second, it just seems to be parked by the side of the road. Whereas if you take it maybe at a 500th or maybe even a 100th, then you'll be able to see the blur in the wheel arches. You'll be able to see maybe the blur of the background as well if you're doing a slow pan. And it brings it to life. It gives you energy in the shot. And that's what we want. I started life as a wildlife photographer taking portraits. Yes, some of the animals are beautiful, but I'll always prefer an action shot now. And one of the ways to get more energy, more movement, is to introduce a little bit of blur, controlled amount of blur. Depth of field, as I mentioned earlier, is quite important, partly because you want to isolate the subject. Now, imagine this image taken at f16. What would be the problem? That bangle, that colourful bracelet would be in your face. You couldn't take your eyes off it. Now, it's kind of nice to have the bangle. It kind of says something about India and the kind of people you meet over there being very colourful and so on. But you don't want it to be sharp in this situation because it would be distracting. As it is, it's kind of bearable because it's blurred out. I used, I think, f4 or something like that. So it was pretty wide aperture. But depth of field is important because it allows the eye, as I said before, to focus on the subject. That's the most important thing. One of the other strange things about the human eye is that we tend to like odd numbers. I don't know why, but if you're doing a still life or if you're taking a picture of a group of animals or birds, try and make sure it's 3 or 5 subjects rather than 2 or 4. It just looks better. Don't ask me why. Fill the frame is also something that we all tell each other. Yes, we have to fill the frame. I've seen many pictures where there's something in the corner and the photographers had to point it out and say, no, but if you look in the corner, you can see a golden eagle. Where? Which corner? Oh, yeah, top right, you mean? Oh, yes, okay. Well, fair enough. Sometimes you don't have the lens that's long enough to do that. And I was lucky in this case because it was actually a falconry display and I was only about 5 feet away from the eagle. And I had a very long lens. But if you fill the frame, you get an image like this. You can see every single feather, every single last bit of detail. That's what it's all about. Yes, I love really detailed, sharp portraits like this. And of course, we also have a bit of bokeh in the background, nice blurred background, which is also good. Now, the aspect ratio is important from a couple of points of view. First of all, cameras are designed to shoot landscape, aren't they? That is the default mode. They could have been designed the other way around. It would have been quite easy to do that. You could have controls simply shifted around 90 degrees, but they're not. So that means that 90% of the shots that people take are in landscape mode. So it's very important, particularly when you're taking pictures of wildlife, to tell yourself to switch that camera around. I think Andy Skillen, who's a wildlife photographer, once told me you should be taking roughly 1/3 of your pictures portrait rather than landscape, vertical rather than horizontal. You have to force yourself to do it sometimes, but think about the composition. So in this case, you've got the pillars, which are going vertically up and down. You've got the position of the pig, so you see more longitudinally than you do the other way around. So it's kind of obvious that you need portrait mode. Sometimes it won't be quite as obvious, but at least try it out every now and again. And the other big benefit, of course, is that magazine covers are portrait format. Yes, so if you want a magazine cover on your CV, then you need to shoot some portrait shots. The other thing to do with aspect ratio is that you can control it. So most cameras have a 3:2 aspect ratio, whether it's portrait or landscape, but you can do whatever you like in landscape mode or portrait mode using Lightroom or Photoshop or whichever bit of software you use. So I often use the panoramic setting, which I've just set up as a preset. So it's 3:1 rather than 3:2. So if you have a herd of elephant passing a group of vehicles or something, you want to show a long line of the elephants. It's ideal for a panorama. Okay. You can also do vertical panoramas, but that's probably less common. But play around with it. Sometimes also in these Instagram obsessed days, you'll want something that's square. I absolutely can't stand square images. I know about 2 in my entire portfolio. But if you want it to look good in Instagram or on Squarespace, which has also a square format, then that's something you can always do. Just bear in mind when you're actually taking the shot that you have a vague idea of what the ultimate aspect ratio is going to be. If you're going to leave it in 3:2, that's fine. But if you're going to change it to 4:3 or 5:4 or something, then you need to make sure you've got space at either side because that's going to be cropped in. Foreground interest. So is this a shot of a topee or a shot of a sunset? Well, it's both, isn't it? So the foreground interest is the topee, but of course to me, I just love the colors, and that's all about the sunset. But if I hadn't had the topee there, it would just be a bit, meh. Yes? So you need both. Wildlife photography needs good backgrounds. And sunset and sunrise are obviously a great time to shoot, great light, the golden hour, or even the golden 15 minutes just before sunset or just after sunrise. But they always work in combination with the subject. And the topee has a nice recognizable silhouette, even if you don't know what a topee is. And it was just in the right position for the shot. So it marries the foreground with the background. And that's what we need sometimes. Now, when I talk about balance, it's a little bit like negative space, except in this case, we're balancing subjects on both sides, not balancing a subject with negative space. So in this case, this is my top-selling image. I've sold this 2,047 times. Who knew that penguins would be so popular? a jumping penguin. That's how I always refer to it. And it's very, very popular. One of the reasons, not the only reason, one of the reasons it's popular is that it's balanced. So you've got the group of penguins on the left, looking a bit dubious. Oh, that looks a bit far to me. I'm not sure he's going to make it. Not sure about that. I'm just going to dive in the water. Whereas the leader has made the leap, and fortunately he managed to land it, so that's fine. But I was very happy with this, and I was just amazed when it went viral. You know, I couldn't really understand why. I didn't even rate it 5 stars when I first took it. But I think it's just something about jumping penguins. I don't know why. You know, people think that penguins can't fly. Of course, in this case, it kind of looks as if it is flying, I guess. But the ultimate credit was when I was watching a film called Atypical, and it was all about this guy who had Asperger's, and he was desperate for a girlfriend. The only thing we knew about him was he loved penguins. So when he eventually manages to get his girlfriend, they're walking on the corridor at school, and he opens his locker, and there, inside his locker door, was a poster of My Jumping Penguin. Hurrah! Great moment. Juxtaposition just means putting two opposites together. So whether it's colors or ages or anything you can think of as opposites. So in this case, it's, you know, technology versus the natural world. It's man versus animal. You know, there is a little bit of a link. There's orange in the rock and orange gloves. There's also red around the ptarmigan's eye and red on my friend Eric's jacket, which is all fine. But basically, it's juxtaposition. Exodus, in fact, uses this for one of its competitions, the wildlife competition. Patterns and textures. I don't take that many black and white shots, but when it comes to elephants, A, they tend to have colour in the first place, and B, they already have lots of patterns and textures, which tends to lend themselves to black and white. So in this particular case, I screwed up the original shot. It wasn't well composed, but I cropped in from the left and from the bottom so that the eye and the tusk are both only a few millimeters from the edge, and it seems to be quite popular. But using black and white, by removing the color element, will emphasize everything else. So shapes, patterns, textures, whatever you like to call them, those are the things that then become important. Simplicity, well, you can tell from this shot, it's simple. Yes, I was lucky when I went to Iguazu in South America. This is like the Niagara Falls of South America. There was actually a bird aviary just across the road. I spent more time there than the waterfall. And I was lucky because I saw this flamingo in bright sunshine, but behind it was the shade of a few very tall fir trees. So I was able to get a good black background. Black backgrounds are quite difficult to find in nature. You have to manufacture them to a certain extent. If an animal is in the sunshine with shade behind, as this was, then it's always a good opportunity. You can, by all means, underexpose by a couple of stops, use your exposure compensation to do that, or you can fiddle around in Lightroom or Photoshop. But having a black background is obviously one way of adding simplicity to a picture. You're totally focused on the subject. And in a similar vein, if you do have, I don't know, ripples in the water or something in the background that you don't like, you can always just take it down a bit, make it a little bit darker, maybe clone out one or two things. I'm not too worried about doing that. In this case, I think there are a few highlights in the water. When I took this picture of malachite kingfisher, I just darkened the water a little bit. It's not quite black, but it's just darker, so you don't see it. It's almost a black background. What you want most of all is simplicity. You don't want anything to distract you in the background. So a classic example is a lamppost coming out of someone's head. Obviously, there aren't many lampposts in Africa, but I did take that picture of the elephant we saw before giving itself a dust bath, and I got just about the only telegraph wire in Botswana in the background, which obviously I have to take out. Annoying. But yes, check the edges of your frame. Don't just focus entirely on the subject. The background is almost as important as the subject. It's often easy to forget these two factors, humour and cuteness. How many times do we see a nice picture of an animal and we go, "Ah," Poor girl side hates that. But that is one of the things we love about pictures of animals, particularly baby animals. We like to see the cuteness. And also we like it when they do funny things. I've got a classic video of a little baby gorilla desperately trying to pull out a root so it can nibble on it. It tries once, can't do it. Tries twice, can't do it. And the third time it pulls it out, but it comes out so quickly, the gorilla ends up tumbling back down the slope on its back. Very funny. Okay. So in your pictures, try and capture that. In this particular case, it was a picture of these two king penguins who spent literally 10 minutes trying, I imagine, to work out whether this is an egg or a rock. You can imagine the conversation. Is this our egg? No, darling. No, that's over there. No, I'm sure it's our egg. No, it's not even an egg, darling. It's just a stone, for goodness sake. You can imagine the conversation. Obviously, it's probably not quite that. But it was very funny. And they spent ages until eventually, I think the hubby had his way. It's like, oh, come on, darling, let's move along. It's just a stone. Okay. Finally, knowing when to break the rules. That's the key thing. Some people say, well, if you follow the rules, all your pictures are just the same. I don't really think that's true. But there are occasions when you can break the rules. For instance, the rule of thirds might suggest that you need to put your horizon a third of the way up or a third of the way down, depending on whether the sky or the land bit is more interesting. But in the case of a silhouette on the horizon, your horizon is always just going to be a black stripe. So what's the point of having that in the frame? So you might say this is breaking the rules, or you might say this is just another special example of a rule, or you might say it's just another rule completely. But knowing when to do that kind of thing is important. And it's all about experimentation. Just suck it and see what you can do. And ultimately, I'm hoping that you'll benefit in terms of your pictures. Right, that's the end of my presentation. So feel free to jump in, Colin. I hope that's been useful. I hope you've enjoyed it. Now feel free to give me a few questions or ask whatever you like.
It's been fantastic, Nick. A really, really interesting evening. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your experiences and a bit of your world in the wildlife, photography industry. It's been fascinating talk tonight. I've really, really enjoyed it.
My pleasure.
We've had a few questions. So Karen was asking, how do you feel about tight crops on animals? I love them, but some people say they would like to see more of the animal. You probably covered it a little bit in the slideshow, in the presentation you just did then. But I don't know if you wanted to expand on those comments.
Sure. I think rules are all very well, but sometimes you just kind of have to have a feeling for the image. And it's very subjective, obviously. There's a friend of mine who showed me some of her pictures recently. They're beautiful. I mean, she's a very good photographer. But I just felt that the animals needed a little bit of room to breathe. And what I mean by that is if you crop to within a few millimeters of the edge of the animal, then that doesn't look good. However, if it's a close-up which doesn't have any background in, which is actually just the animal, so like my elephant, for example, just a close-up of the elephant, then you don't actually see any sky or any trees or anything like that. So you can go in as close as you like. Personally, I love close-ups. So I've got this 800mm lens, which expands to 1000mm. So close-ups are good. You just have to kind of have a feeling for it. Don't go too tight around the animal. You obviously need a little bit of room to allow it to move into the frame. Just don't get too tight. And obviously, when you do crop, make sure you're cropping at the right point. Make sure it's deliberate, first of all. Don't just crop out one finger or one toe or something. But also don't crop at joints. So ankles, fetlocks, knees, waists, necks, shoulders, it just looks weird. So crop in the joints.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Brilliant. I think that last one is answered perfectly. Rob's asking, he said at the time this may come up later, any tips for dealing with temperature changes, drop as it gets dark, for example, and managing humidity? Monsoon in India, humidity can change in minutes. Both these can impact the lens and the camera electronics.
Yes, I'm afraid I can't give you any tips, but I do totally understand the problem. I've been in the butterfly house, for instance, at London Zoo, and you go in and for 20 minutes you can't take a shot. So maybe just waiting. I know that I have heard people suggest that you can put your camera in a bag. So for instance, if for example, it's very cold outside, you can actually leave your camera outside or maybe in a cubby hole or something, so at least it's safe. But don't take it into the nice warm ski chalet or wherever you're staying. And that way, when you go out again in the morning, it's still roughly at the same temperature, so it won't need that 20 minutes to warm up or cool down. But I don't think there's any ideal solution. It's just difficult, and you may just have to be patient about it.
Yeah, completely agree. Birgit is asking, what kind of images sell best, and how do you find buyers?
So yes, so I've done a little bit of analysis. I'm a little bit like that. I used to be a consultant, so I like doing analysis of my images. So sometimes I look at which images have sold best. It's kind of skewed by my jumping penguin, which has just sold so many times. I obviously sell more penguins than anything else. But if you take out the penguin, then actually jaguars and bears come top. So in terms of the animals, there's always this kind of trade-off between the popularity of an animal and how many pictures there are already. So how many pictures are there of pangolins? Well, probably about 5 worldwide, but nobody's really heard of them. So demand is low and also supply is low. Whereas when it comes to lions, you've got great demand for lions. I just had, I think, 1,700 people see my latest shot of the week on Instagram. It was a lion shot, funnily enough. But they're at 10 a penny. Yes, everyone has a lion shot. So you just have to find the sweet spot. So in my experience, there's a benefit to going to far-flung places. So penguins you only get down there in Antarctica. So it's more difficult to get there, so fewer people have those shots. It cost me about 14 grand or something to go on my cruise. So it's more difficult to get them, but they're still very popular. So that's one of the sweet spots. Jaguars, again, more difficult to get to South America, therefore more popular, and it's just a little bit different. We've seen all the cats in Africa, they're 10 a penny. What about a different cat? Oh, let's have a look at the jaguar. When it comes to how to make money out of photography, perhaps this is the moment to say that if you have a look at my website, which is on the screen or should be, nickdalephotography.com, there's a ton of material there. I've done a few blog posts on how to make money out of photography, for instance. So that gives you all the possibilities. I was just talking earlier, before we started this broadcast, about how I've tried to do it. It's just a question of pushing it every single door and seeing which one opens. So I sell maybe 40% of my stuff through stock agencies or microstock agencies by value, 40% through exhibitions in terms of prints, and then maybe 20% from talks and lessons, workshops, that kind of thing. So I would certainly put some of your images into the stock agencies or microstock agencies. It's a volume versus value thing. So the microstock agencies will only pay you 25 cents for an image, but you might make 6 or 7 sales a day. And over time, you might end up making a couple of £100 a month. So that's passive income. It's just money while you sleep, which is great. Exhibitions are more of an investment. You might have to spend £1,000 on a decent venue on a King's Road or somewhere. But there are smaller places. My first exhibition, I thought would never happen. I thought it was just one of those dreams that you have as a photographer, just be far too expensive. But in fact, someone told me about the Norman Plasto Gallery in Wimbledon, 70 quid. That's almost throwaway money. So I was able to do that. I had to be there myself, which is annoying, but I managed to make £1,000. I sold something like 12 pictures. In those days, I was selling them for 80, 100 quid. These days, I'm selling them for 800 or £1,000. But I've moved up in the world in terms of where I'm having my exhibitions. In those days, that was low risk, throwaway money. These days, I'm going to have to spend £1,000 on the exhibition. So I'm going to have to be pretty confident I'm going to sell at least one picture to make it worthwhile. And what with commission rates usually at 50%, that's very tricky. So a lot of photographers these days do other things. So they lead trips, for instance. I've led 1 or 2 trips. I've given workshops. I've given lessons to people. Everything makes a little bit of money. So you can't necessarily rely on your pictures alone to make a decent income. You have to open a different door.
Perfect. Perfectly answered. Stephen's got a great question. I think it was Stephen. What's the dream shot you've not taken yet?
Yeah, that's a good question. I spent an awful lot of time jokingly on safaris. When people ask you, so what would you like to see today? I say, well, actually, I really like to see a crocodile taking down a pregnant elephant at the top of a tree on the banks of the Cherry River. Okay, let's bring it down. Okay, realistically do you want to see? I think for me, because I'm a bloke, probably, I love kills. You know, I went on maybe 5 or 6 safaris before I saw my first kill, and it was incredibly frustrating. There is just nothing like the rush of seeing, in particular, a cheetah kill. It's just amazing. It all happens in about 8 seconds, so you have to be on the ball, you have to get the settings right. But the moment that I found that one shot out of about 25 that I showed you earlier, I was on a high, which is fantastic. I get most of my pleasure from getting great shots. I think the one thing that I've succeeded in doing in terms of a great photography goal was that shot of the bear catching salmon at Brooks Falls. To me, that's one of the great wildlife, bucket list experiences. People ask me how long it took to take that shot. I say, well, either a 1600th of a second or a week, depending on how you look at it. But I think of the things that I haven't done yet, yes, there are 1 or 2 animals, the snow leopard, maybe I'd like to see, but I haven't really seen a good Mara River crossing. I'd love to see all the wildebeest like that, maybe a crocodile kill, something like that. But again, anytime I see a kill of any animal, I'm happy, whether it's in Africa or South America or anywhere else.
Brilliant. Keith's asking, if you shoot raw, why set the white balance?
Good point. Yes. So the reason I set the white balance is that when you're in the vehicle what the lighting conditions are. When you get back home, you're on a computer, you've got 4,000 images in front of you, you've forgotten. You can't possibly remember what the situation was. So I know in theory you can change it. The trouble is you don't often know what to change it to. That's the problem. So yes, if you use auto, that's fine. And then if it's obvious that it's a sunny day or a sunny bit of the day, then yes, you can change it. But oftentimes I've been in this situation, I just thought, oh, hang on a second, is this supposed to be sunny or is it supposed to be cloudy? Not quite sure. And yes, you can use the little eyedropper tool, but that just takes an awful lot of time. So I think if you're at least good enough that you can remember generally when the conditions change, then it's a much better way of doing it. At least you get absolutely spot on white balance, and then you don't have to worry about it during post-processing.
Brilliant. Stephen's asked if you use times converters.
If I use teleconverters?
Yeah.
I have a teleconverter for my 800mm lens. Yes, it's a 1.25 times teleconverter or extender in Canon terms. And that gives you 1,000mm rather than 800. And I have used it. I did use it quite a bit when I was in Africa. In this particular case, it's a very, very high-end lens with a very, very high-end teleconverter that's specifically designed for it. So I know that there's the usual trade-off between convenience and image quality. I did read something recently by Steve Perry. He's done extensive testing on teleconverters. He reckons it's actually better to use teleconverters than to crop in later, and it's certainly more convenient. Now, it obviously depends on the teleconverter. Some are good, some are bad, and he's talking about mostly high-end teleconverters. Some lenses lend themselves to using teleconverters, some don't. But that was an interesting data point. I've never seen data on that that was so good. So I would generally say no problem at all. But as I say, in this particular case, the one I have is no problem at all. It's a very, very good piece of kit, cost me 16 grand or something. So I don't have a problem with that.
Perfect. Gary's asking, do you switch off image stabilization when using a high shutter speed?
Well, speaking of Steve Perry, actually, this was one of the things he recommended, and I haven't up until now, but I think I will start to do that, yes. And again, he puts data behind what he's saying, which is great. And I recommend that you go to Backcountry Gallery and have a look at some of the videos he's done. There's a lot of free stuff, so you can have a look at all of it. But yes, I think the data he brought to the party was that actually you will end up with a slightly less sharp image if you use VR at high shutter speeds. So that is critical. A lot of wildlife photography is about getting tack sharp images, rather like that eagle I showed you earlier. And if VR is going to muck about with that, I'm not going to use it. So I think the rule of thumb, in Steve Perry's words, is I would use VR if it's slower than the inverse of the focal length. So with an 800mm lens, if it's slower than an 800th of a second, yes, by all means use VR. But if you're able to use a shutter speed at 2,000th or 4,000th or something, don't worry about it. And yes, it will look a little bit wobbly when you're actually taking the pictures. But if you're at a 4,000th of a second, shouldn't be a problem.
Cool. Stephen's asking, is there a good time of year to visit Africa?
Yes, there's actually a very good site called safaribookings.com, and it will show you the best time to go to every single African safari destination, which is fantastic. So in Africa, you generally have short rains and long rains. In certain places, you can pretty much go throughout the year, but in certain other places, you absolutely can't. So in the Okavango Delta, for instance, you want to go when there's water in the delta. There's no point seeing a dry delta, that'd be useless. So it absolutely is important to know when that is. And it just happens to coincide with the peak safari months, which are generally July to October. The other issue to bear in mind is the Great Migration. So that's when something like 2.5 million wildebeest go around a big circle, around Tanzania and Kenya. If you go at the wrong time, you don't see the migrating wildebeest and zebra and so on, and therefore you have less chance of seeing the kill, and sometimes game drives can be a bit dull, to be honest. As soon as the migration arrives, the world changes. I went on a safari to the Masai Mara once, and it lasted about 6 hours, and there wasn't a single minute when I didn't see at least 10,000 wildebeest. So you want to go during the Great Migration. And it's generally July to October, something like that. The key moment is if you want to see the Mara River crossing, where you see just thousands of wildebeest tumbling off these very tall sand cliffs and possibly getting eaten by crocodiles. And that's generally around the end of July, maybe August. But wildebeest are very uncooperative. I was there once for the whole day. We were waiting and waiting for them to cross the river. They never did. And in the end, our driver got a bit enthusiastic, went down to the river and got kicked out of the park. So you have a bit of luck. But at least most of these sites like Exodus and so on, they will tell you when it's migration season. So it's a bit easier. Safaribookings.com, though, that's another place to look.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I think that's the majority, in fact, all the questions caught up with now. So again, thank you so much for joining us tonight, sharing your experiences and your knowledge, and answering all those questions. Again, if members want to find out more about you, then they can head to the website www.nickdalephotography.com. And if you're tuned in, please drop a thank you in the comments for Nick, and give the video a like so he knows that you've all been tuning in, listening, and enjoying the webinar that's been here tonight. If you've tuned in halfway through, don't worry, this will be on repeat through the units tab as always, and also via the website, which is thesocieties.net/webinars. And the password is the word member to get you in. So you can, if you've missed the first half of the presentation, you can go back and rewatch it all again. So just double checking. I think that is all the questions for tonight. So again, thank you very much, Nick. We really appreciate you coming here and giving this seminar for us. We really do appreciate it.
My pleasure. And thanks for everyone for watching. I really do appreciate it as well.
Great. Thank you very much. Take care, Nick.
Cheers. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.